I think you've given us a lot of the background, right? Of like what kind of family you grew up in, what kind of beliefs you were raised with, how you kind of continued on with those beliefs into your teenage years.
Oh, yeah.
And you kind of found this community of like-minded people, but through, it sounds like, and you can kind of follow up on this, but it sounds like through these like bulletins that you were writing on, the communications that you were having via the pre-internet there, that you were starting at least to run into some cognitive dissonances.
Eventually. Now I have to phrase it. While I was in Germany, there was no cognitive dissonance for me. Everything made sense. I was kind of not sure how I would classify myself. I always had an anarchist streak in myself, even when I was at these camps. I rarely ever wore the uniform that everybody wore. I didn't like the discipline. I don't like being told what to do if I don't fully grab it. And I always make this joke, if I would have grown up under the Nazis, I would have gotten in trouble, not because I was against the Nazis, but because I pissed somebody off. Um, just by saying, nope, don't want that, don't believe in that. That is bullshit. Who are you? Like, who killed God and made you my deity? This kind of stuff. So I always had this kind of individualistic tendencies. So I wasn't really much a movement person as such. So I was never really in the movement where I would meet every weekend or so with the same people in a very organized way and come up with stuff. I would go to the summer camps and holiday camps, whatever. And I would do my own reading. I would wage the holy war for the future of Germany in school by counter-argumenting people all the time and being on the internet. It wasn't really until I left Germany with my parents to go to Canada and I went to university, or at least I wanted to go to college first, and I wanted to study computer science engineering, but that's a different story. Anyway, I ended up taking these remedial classes, particularly in English and some math. And because it was in Ottawa and I lived outside of Ottawa, I had a lot of time on my hands. And I spent this time on my hand exploring the early beginnings of the internet, whether it was geosites or whatever, but also Usenet. And Usenet at the time, I mean, it still kind of exists, but nobody cares about it anymore. Usenet at the time was where you went if you wanted to have discussions with complete strangers on particular topics. And I got involved in a news group called Die Sagball, so German political stuff. And I, of course, went in there guns a-blazing as a hardcore right-wing Holocaust denier. And it wasn't, don't think my racism was that bad at the time, because that never really mattered all that much to me. I believe that black people shouldn't be in a white country and white people shouldn't be in a black country and this kind of stuff. But fundamentally, I didn't spend too much time hating other people from other races, although I didn't like Turks and Germans, this kind of stuff. But it didn't occupy my mind too much. What occupied my mind was history. Philosophy and this kind of stuff, and trying to argue why these things taught about Germany were lies. And I think what kept me in this thinking way longer than necessary is the radical inability of many in positions of authority, let's say, whether it's teachers or some other people, to engage with a young person who has extreme ideas. Now, there's different types of these. There's young people who have extreme ideas and you can't talk to them. They're not interested in conversation, right? They have the ideas and the best you get out of it is being insulted and getting a punch in the face. Other people like to argue. I liked to argue. It's just something I did since I was a kid. I liked to argue about anything. And it didn't matter who you were. Just because you're an authority figure didn't mean I couldn't try to poke a hole into what you had to say.
I mean,
But
it
rather,
goes along with your individualistic streak and kind of your rejection of authority. Yeah.
exactly. So, but unfortunately, very few teachers, actually none, really engaged with me on a level that would drill down to my assumptions, why my assumption was wrong. And I think it has to do with the fact that most teachers are not trained to do this and do not have the intellectual resources to deal with that. And this is where it brings me, how did I get out of this? And this is really, I think, it's my story. It's not everybody's story, but I think it shows there is a way of getting to people who grew up like me in fundamentally a cult, fundamentally unapproachable, especially if you don't have your ducks in a row in terms of your arguments, because I knew a lot about these topics. I knew way more than my contemporaries. I knew a lot more weird, obscure details my teachers had never heard of, that they couldn't counter because they weren't into it. But what happened when I went to Canada, first of all, I was out of my normal social circles, right? And then after a year in Canada, I was also out of my family circle because I ended up going to university. And for reasons that don't matter, I started reading even more than ever before. I was always a reading kid. I would always have 2 or 3 books on the go ever since I could read. And I started reading voraciously when I was in Canada, even before I went to university. All kinds of things, from history, from geography, to Lord of the Rings, to sci-fi, whatever, you name it. I read more than ever before in my life. And I started to read a magazine called Skeptic Magazine by a guy called Michael Shermer, who nowadays is not somebody I would want to be found dead in the same room with. But back then, had this Skeptic Magazine. He may still publish it, I don't know. And I liked it because he was going against a lot of things that I had no time for, whether it was moon landing was fake, conspiracy theories, or young Earth creationism, because I was raised anti-religious. I was raised anti-Christian. So I never had anything to do with religion. That was not something that bugged me. So I liked what he wrote about all this kind of stuff, including some fake histories that I knew were fake histories. I can't think of any particular example right now because it doesn't really matter, but it's basically a lot of correction of what people believe and challenging of stupid ideas. And I liked it. I respected his writing. And then I came across this book called Why People Believe Weird Things. I can't, for some reason, I always forget to look up the table of content because that's very important, but fundamentally wrote this book, Why People Believe Weird Things. And it was by Michael Shermer, so I was happy to read it. And I opened it, and I had all the topics that I'm concerned about. Let's see, I have a picture here. Maybe it shows that the kind of weird things. Doesn't matter, but it's like creationism, alternative medicine, moon landing fake, this kind of stuff. Also Atlantis, you name it. The last chapter in the book, as I remember it, again, I should look it up to get the story actually correct at some point, because I don't know if it was the last chapter or the penultimate chapter, but I think it was the last chapter, was about Holocaust, And I was feeling cocky. I was like, okay, let's see what you got. So I got the book and I read it. I was like, agree. And the beautiful thing about that book, and this is why I recommend people to read it, despite Shermer being a jackass nowadays, he doesn't just tell you what we know to be true. He explains in many examples how we know things to be true, how we can gain confidence that something is more true than something else. I mean, when I say, how do you know things are true? Somebody can come up with Papa and say, we can never. That's not the point. We're talking about colloquial, day-to-day, run-of-the-mill, street epistemology, basically. How do we know what's true? And it's not that simple, right? It's complicated because records are complicated. Documentation can be fake. Documentation can be missing. We may not know the motives behind what was written at some point. For example, there's this one argument that Holocaust deniers like to bring up. There's literally no single order by Hitler to kill the Jews. Doesn't exist. There are some documents that show that he was aware of it, but there is no written order, as far as I know, that says kill the Jews. It's just not how he operated. But if you're a Holocaust denier, that's a great argument to bring up and say, hey, Hitler never said kill the Jews. They did all kinds of terrible things, but there's no order. There's no Führerbefehl for the Holocaust. Anyway, and then there is things, for example, some stories of the Holocaust are nonsense. And that's actually to be expected. You see, the Holocaust deniers like to hone in on contradictions in testimonies and find Holocaust testimony that are sometimes absurd, because these things couldn't have happened in that way. For a Holocaust denier and for a person who doesn't understand how memory works, this is a really good edge in to show, see, there's something wrong here. And it wasn't until I read this book where Schirmer talked about false memories and the unreliability of memories and made a really interesting argument that I never thought about. If all the testimonies of all the Holocaust survivors were without contradiction and without absurdity at any point, they were all like clean, super, totally fit each other, and there's no hole, that would be a reason to be suspicious. Because that is not how memory works. Memory was messy. We remember things that never happened. We remember things that happening to us that happened to other people. Remember things that happened to us as having happened to other people. We don't remember dates. Ask me what I had 3 days ago for lunch. I have no bloody idea. Ask me when I read this book that was decisive in my life, and I'm still not sure whether I was 21 or 22. These are significant glitches in memory. And it wasn't until I read one of his arguments was like, look, we talked about the weirdness of human testimony in all the other chapters, and now we're talking about here again. And the beauty of that chapter really is that he prepared the ground for every argument I had by addressing it in a different context, in a different way. So that is when I first really encountered my biggest cognitive dissonance of my life, fundamentally.
And it sounds like it's because it broke you out of that closed epistemology.
It totally forced me to make a decision, an intellectual decision, and that was, do I reject the toolkit of skeptical analysis, or do I reject my belief that the Holocaust was a hoax? And then I kind of was thinking about, of course I didn't think about it in these terms, but that was kind of my thinking process. And at some point I decided that rejecting the toolkit of skepticism, or rejecting the toolkit of converging evidence and how you can make sense of contradictory evidence, but you develop a whole picture and you look at the grander picture, and then you come to grand conclusions, this could have happened, this couldn't have happened, etc. If I rejected that toolkit, I would have no defense against any kind of bullshit that would come at me in the world. I would have no defense against young Earth creationism. I would have no defense against moon landing hoaxes. I would have no defense against homeopathy advocates, all this kind of stuff. I would have no defense against climate change denial, which, by the way, my wife reminded me the other day, until at least 2003, 2004, if not longer, I was still uncertain whether climate change was real. I was going back and forth, constantly bouncing back and forth. But the point is, I made this decision that literally had very little to do with the Holocaust itself. It was a decision about how to approach the world, how to approach thinking about the world in a coherent way. And once I made the decision about which tool set to use, I couldn't maintain my belief in the Holocaust being a hoax. It just didn't work. And since then, it was such a massive part of my overall self-identity, how I felt about being Dietwald, about being German, about being born in this time of history. All of that got shocked because this happened to be the very foundation of it. And it also meant that I had to question everything my parents told me. This was the first time, I was 21 or 22, that I seriously questioned my parents. I mean, most people do that when they're 16, 17, right? I question my parents on some decisions, on like daily life, but fundamentally, philosophically, this was like being raised in a radical Christian household. And then at some point, realizing Christianity doesn't work for me, it doesn't make sense to me, and I think it's untrue. I assume you're Christian, so please don't take offense here. To me, all religions are nonsense.
I'm not, by the way. I'm not.
Okay, okay, you're American. I always assume that every American is a Christian in some form. But fundamentally, I would have rejected Christianity and then everything that goes with it, because you can't just reject Holocaust hoaxery and saying, no, the Holocaust happened, because there's a whole rat tail of consequences. What does it mean for the Germans? What does it mean about what happened in Germany? What does it mean about me as a German? What does it mean for my place in society, in history? Not in a grand way, but how do I fit in? So I literally have spent the last 26 years or so, restructuring, continuously restructuring, reworking what I believe in and how I come to believe. Now, how that has to do with racism. So the racism comes from that. Racism is a baked-in assumption when you are raised like me. Black people are, of course, intellectually and culturally inferior, except they can sing well and dance dance well, but there was never a great black composer. So you know this shit, right? I was raised up with, but all of that had to be questioned now, because now I'm in Canada and suddenly I actually meet people from different races. I mean, you live in Northwest Germany, the most exotic you get is a Turk. That's about it. Like a Turk or Yugoslav, and something from the distance you see an African American if you go to a big city, right? You don't see that. And it wasn't until probably the 80s, 90s that I became aware of things like asylum seekers coming to Germany, and there were asylum seeker camps. And I started seeing Black people, but they were all poor and miserable, right? And I didn't think like you would think if you didn't grow up in a screwed up environment, that these are the results, these people living this miserably and looking that miserable is a result of complex global political economic issues. And the fact that I live well and they don't actually isn't just two independent facts, but actually are closely linked to each other in many ways. But I didn't think that. I just saw people who looked miserable. And it was like the only Black people I saw were visually just one step above homeless people. That is a great way to reinforce your racism, right? Especially you don't talk to them. Why would you talk to them? I could have talked to them. I walked by their home. They were sitting outside. Nothing in the world would have stopped me going there and said, "Hi, guys. How are you? Like, what are you doing here? Tell me about yourself." That never occurred to me. Never. I knew everything about them. There's worth knowing. They don't belong here. They need to get out. They are sent here to destroy the white people. You think great replacement theory is a new thing? I gotta bust your bubble here, but I grew up with that stuff. So that stuff is not new, and that's how we thought. But I had to question that. So then it comes, and then I had to question, how do I think about economics? How do I think about global politics? How do I think about the state? Right? How do I think about laws? How do I think about borders? How do I think about international travel, international trade, all these kind of things? Everything had to be questioned. And then I went to university and I studied Eastern European studies. I actually studied Russia and Eastern Europe. I'm a certified expert on Russia and Eastern Europe who didn't predict the Ukraine invasion. So that's how much academic standing really matters, I guess. But that's a different topic. So I went to university and I increasingly came across ideas I didn't know about. Once I sat down, it was actually really weird. I sat down, was sitting out in the park at the university, and this young woman, we started talking. I think we knew each other from a class. And I explained to her something I cooked up in my brain about how morality works. And she looked at me and was like, "Yeah, it's called postmodernism." I'm like, "What? Post what?" So I had to read up on postmodernism. I'm like, "Oh, I cooked that up." Of course, the bits and pieces are in the air. It's not like I'm in the 17th century and I like independently come up with postmodernism out of ex nihilo like some genius. No, the elements were there, but my brain was constantly repackaging how I think about stuff. And at that point, I had, what, I was like 24 or something. I had landed at fundamentally being a postmodernist without ever knowing that was a thing. Just to show how much stuff my brain went through in terms of thinking. I come from hardcore right-wing ethno-essentialist nationalism, and I kind of worm my way through to postmodernist ideas and then socialist ideas and rejecting it. And then there's always phases in your intellectual development where you can pinpoint the exact time and day something changed. For example, I had an economics teacher, a Russian guy, standard run-of-the-mill Keynesian, nothing exciting in retrospect, but he one day came to class and said, basically, "Today I'm going to explain to you why planned economies don't work." I'm like, "Oh, interesting," because I was firmly convinced planned economies could work, just enough computing power. And then he walked us through all the arguments, and he brought up names I'd never heard, brought up Mises, brought up Hayek, and this, just like in passing. I was like, what's going on here? And I walked out of this class. I walked into the class. If anybody had asked me on the day I walked into the class, do you think plant economies can work? I would have said, yep, absolutely, totally. Then 90 minutes later, I walked out of the class. You would have asked me, does plant economy work? I was like, nope. And anybody who believes it is a dumbass.
That's like the essence of like learning new things that you just described there, you know? Like, I mean, I applaud you for, you know, going through this process. I have so many things I want to say. All right. So I'm going to start with one thing that resonated with me, which is you said what reinforced your racism.
Yeah.
You talked about observing Black people in kind of a state of misery and, you know, downtroddenness, and that kind of reinforced the ideas you already had about Black people. Well, in the United States,
not really consciously, right? Oh, this proves they're Black, but it just there was no contradiction. It just visually reaffirmed it. Yes.
exactly, and that's the same thing I mean. I don't mean that like you were like just exactly what I thought, you know, or anything like that. It's like it's exactly latent, exactly like you're describing there, and it's very similar dynamic here in the United States. It might be a little more aggressive than that, I would say, because the messaging is very heavy in the media, has always been for generations here, that Black people are poor, that Black people are victims, that Black people take advantage of the government, that Black people, you know, are
Hip hop
criminals.
culture, right? Hip hop culture represents Black culture, right?
Right.
You see the worst of the worst of hip hop culture on music TV, and that is seen as Black culture. And sorry for interrupting you. This has an interesting feedback loop to Germany, by the way. Turkish people in Germany, while the history is quite different, and the way their position in society has different causes, there are some parallels with how Blacks are treated and are perceived in North America. Curiously and probably disastrously in many ways, young Turkish people, this is a very broad stroke painting with a broad brush, but anyway, it's about the point. They look in the way it seems, they look at Black culture in America as transmitted through popular media. And they see the parallels between Blacks and themselves, although they would hardly ever admit it, because many of them wouldn't identify with Black people due to their own cultural issues, but they see the parallels, right? They feel the parallels. And they start adopting many of the body language and the attitudes and the self-presentation from this very dysfunctional representation of Black culture, which just reinforces all the negative stereotypes you could possibly have. Sorry for going on a side tangent here, but I totally see where you're getting at.
Yeah, and what's crazy about it, right? It makes sense if someone in a different country is receiving those messages and then like misinterpreting them, right? Like that makes sense, but it happens within our own country, right? Like there's so many racialized white people in the United States who also never encounter Black people, like don't live around Black people, don't go to work with Black people, don't go to school with Black people, don't have Black people in their community whatsoever. Some people have been on the show already who say, you know, oh, I didn't meet a Black person until I, you know, went to college, or like, just like, you know, you were saying kind of. And so,
I mean, I've spent 20 something years of my life in Ottawa, Canada, the capital city of Canada. My joke is the Black, like there's a lineup for the token Black friend, because it's so white. It is so incredibly white. And you notice that when you travel from Canada to the United States, first time I went to Washington, D.C., the one thing that struck me more than anything else, how many Black people there are and why they're on the shitty jobs. Very noticeable. But yes, I totally get it. There's a ghettoification in North America, not just for Black people, for white people as well. Everybody lives in their own little cultural ghetto bubble. We get multiculturalism transmitted to us through TV and through the media, and we eat ethnic foods, and that makes us feel very multicultural. But otherwise, white people hang out with white guys. All right, black guys hang out with black guys. And same applies to crime. White people victimize white people in crime, and black people victimize black people in crime because that's the people they live around.
Precisely, precisely. And it's with this country and its history of racial segregation, via legal means, and white supremacy via religion and academia and economics and any other system, really category you want to think about. That is just something that has become endemic. It almost runs with the land here. And so the media that you were talking about was influencing people overseas. That really just kind of like activates people here, in a very visceral way. People very much are in your former position of not wanting to unravel these messages they've been sent about black people. They want to accept these messages that black people are a certain way. And
Yes.
so when it creates this situation, this psychological situation whereby black people succeeding, black people achieving, black people advancing in society, it brings internal discomfort for a lot of racialized white people. And they don't even know what that is. They don't even know how to place it because they've never been challenged to even think of it for even a moment, typically in their lives. So they just kind of act out on that feeling to deal with that.
I raised my child, my white child that was born in one of the whitest parts of North America and now lives in one of the whitest countries you can find outside of Scandinavia. I raised him anything but colorblind. The opposite. When he was young, I never raised the topic of race with him, but the moment he brought up, for example, he asked, why is my friend, why does he have darker skin than I do? Like, what is this? I said, well, it's very simple. His mom and daddy have darker skin than you do, and you have light skin. Okay. I didn't tell him, oh, don't pay attention to that. No, you noticed it. I'm going to put into a context. And then over time, this little conversation, he noticed that his black friend seemed to get in trouble for things that other kids didn't get in trouble for. And I thought, well, it's simple, he's black. What do you mean? This is just what happens. He's a black kid. He stands out. I didn't even necessarily talk about racism. I talk about standing out and like being different from the others and how he then get treated. But I've consciously over the years, ever since he can talk and ask questions, consciously, always very carefully and very mildly, without lecturing, just like casually, always brought up questions of race and how race affects stuff. And he understood this more and more. And now he's 12, and he comes home and he says he's annoyed by the behavior of some of the Turkish kids in school and on the streets. And I told him, like, look, I'm not excusing the individual behavior of each of these Turkish kids who annoy you. Not just him. It's just like generally annoying. But you remember what I taught you about black people in America and how they're perceived and always get into trouble and how everything black is being put down and negative? There's a reaction to that. We constantly in Germany hurt the pride of Turkish people by not giving them citizenship, even though they have been born here 2 or 3 generations ago, right? They have been here since the 60s and 70s, and most of them don't have citizenship yet. We treated them as just guest workers who don't really belong and would go home any day. And they're, until quite recently, they were always called guest workers, even though they've lived here for generations. We don't respect their culture. We always say, oh, you're not German. And if you're told this kind of negative stuff by the culture, you start acting up, you start getting cranky, you either become depressed or you go into over assimilation as in rejecting everything that is about the Turkish identity, or you go like, screw this, I'm gonna piss everybody off. And then they go at the models they get through the terrible media presentation of black culture and gang culture in North America and say, yeah, we're gonna act like this, we're gonna be cool, and we're gonna have swagger. And it's not like they have a political agenda. It's not even conscious. It's just a normal reaction.
Yeah. The natural consequences to their environment. Yeah.
So what I tell my kid, It's like, look, I know why these behaviors by some of these Turkish kids annoy the hell out of you. And this is why you don't have to excuse them individually, but they are not acting this because they are Turkish. They're acting this because they're Turkish in Germany and how we treat them. Because the first generation of Turks who came here, they just wanted to work hard. They wanted to make money, either send money home to the family or bring the family here. They were poor peasants from Eastern Anatolia. They were the lowest of the low social class where they came from. They were used to doing dirty, hard work, and they were happy to do it if you paid them. And they were paid fairly well in Germany. But they were never encouraged to integrate. They were never encouraged to become part of the culture because German national identity is ethnic. You can never be accepted as a German. You could live your entire life in Germany, speak German perfectly, raise your kids speaking perfect German. Every time there's a soccer tournament, you swing the flag because you're proud of your German team to winning, and you're doing it all unironically and honestly just because you believe it. You're still the black guy. You're still not German. A Turk will always be a Turk in Germany. It doesn't matter how many generations they've lived, 3 or 4 or 5 generations. Oh, and to add insult to injury, when in the late 80s and early 90s, when the Soviet Union was crumbling, a lot of people in the former Soviet Union discovered the German ancestry and now had the right to not just move to Germany, but immediately be handed German citizenship. They didn't speak German. They had no connection to Germany other than their vague ancestry from a long time. So these Turks now see these foreigners who were foreigners, they're indistinguishable from Russians, and I don't mean this as an insult, it's just a reality. Indistinguishable from Soviet citizens, at least. They come here and get more rights and more privileges than people who have lived here for 3 or 4 generations and worked hard. You get angry, you get pissed off, even if you don't think about it in these terms. And then we also have the fact that in Germany, we have a 3-tier school system. We have the something we call Hauptschule, which is fundamentally until 9th grade. And after that, you're supposed to go to trade school. Then we have the Realschule, which is a year longer, that prepares you for professional jobs like being a dentist, not necessarily a dentist, because you need a PhD for that, but other like professional jobs. And then you have the gymnasium, which is for the elites. It's 30 years, and you get prepared for university for that. Anybody who values education wants a kid to go to gymnasium. And they get sorted at grade after the 4th grade, all right? Now, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that if you have a population that doesn't speak the language properly, doesn't have proper integration classes, is treated as basically dysfunctional because they don't speak proper German, because that's not spoken at home, how many of these end up going to the gymnasium? It's the whitest schools in Germany are the gymnasium. The most colorful schools are the Hauptschule. The lower you go the education grade, the more you find foreigners, because that's where they're slotted into. So they don't develop, and you also have to consider, where do they come from? They don't come from a population from Eastern Anatolia or other poor Turks, because rich Turks wouldn't go to Germany. What's the poor working Turks? They don't have a strong affinity towards education and higher education culturally to begin with. Just like an Appalachian or a rural American, white American wouldn't think of going to university necessarily, at least in the past. Now it's different. But the point is, we have then a school system that reinforces the disadvantage of these immigrant people, of the Turks who come here. And then it carries on to the next generation. So most Turks do not think about going to gymnasium. Why would they? They have no tradition of that because they were never given the opportunity, never encouraged to do so. In the United States, the problem is economic. You don't sort people by academic ability, you sort them by the economic viability of their parents. Therefore, you have rich schools and you have poor schools. And where do the poor schools go? The poor people. And which demographic in the United States has the most poor people? Black people. Right? So then,
I mean, actually, technically, white people are the largest poor group, but like,
true, but like as share of their own population, right? As share, what is you define as democratic? What is the proportion of them being poor versus the other demographic? And black people have always gotten the short end of the stick there. Therefore, they got the shitty schools. Therefore, they didn't get to university. Therefore, they don't have an academic culture in the sense that You just expect your kids, unless you're a middle class, very upward mobile black person, but the average black person living in an average black community, I don't think dreams of going to university. I think they dream of not being shot by
Yeah,
cops.
but the dreams, like a lot of them dream about going into the NFL or going into the NBA,
Yes,
right? Like so, like
yes.
as somebody who has spent a lot of time teaching racialized black students and immigrants to the United States as well from various countries, like it's this is really resonating with me because I've been able to be that person for them that I didn't have.
Hmm.
My parents, they didn't, they didn't get their bachelor. My mom got her bachelor's degree 2 years before I got mine. You know,
Oh, wow.
and yeah, so like, I mean, I was the first one to get a graduate degree in my family. I was the first one to go to law school in my family. I went through these experiences, very much alone without the kind of backing, not just financial backing, but just like the
Cultural
legacy that
backing. They
these
have to
people who I was going to
give
school
you
with
certain
had.
cultural
Right.
resources and
Exactly. Yeah.
psychological resources to even think about going to university. Never mind hacking it going to university. If you haven't learned the skills and the habits that make you successful there, you're screwed.
And like nobody, you know, there were resources to try to learn them, but then there were all the complications that we talked about before, right? Like, which is like people are looking at you a certain way, people are treating you a certain way. They're not expecting anything from you. They're expecting the worst from you, in fact. So like it's very confusing for someone like me who has been told, right? We get this messaging that, oh, if you work hard, right, and you do what you're supposed to do, you'll be recognized for that. But time after time after time after time, I would recognize that the recognition I would get, it was almost like people drinking their medicine, like people were being force fed it, and they didn't want it. Like my success was something that was sour for them.
Let me go back to my own experience raising a kid. See, I don't see myself in a role where I need to help minorities, where I need to help Black people, I need to help Turks. A, I wouldn't know how, and B, I have other things on my plate in my life. I'm not going to lead a political movement or something like this. I'm going to make a big change in how the institutions work. But I have a kid. And I can raise this kid in a way that this kid doesn't continue on the legacy of having very strong racist beliefs. Will I do a perfect job from it? No, of course not. I'll screw up.
There's
But
no
it's
such
it's
thing
a,
anyway, brother.
and it's also, and here's the thing, it's not about hating white people. I mean, this is the lots of white people. Oh, you're just hating white people. No, I don't. I hate the white attitudes in my fellow white people, but I don't hate white people. I'm a white person, for Christ's sake. Like, why would I hate? Like, this would be just the same nonsense as before. Even
But
though on
there
Twitter,
are people, though, man. There are people. There are racialized white people who end up feeling that way. And then that's another thing that they have to end up unraveling. Like,
yeah,
wait, I'm racialized white. I can't hate racialized white people. Yeah.
it,
And
it,
black people go
it's
through the same thing.
it just, or then in as I said, overcompensating by doing stupid things that if I was Black, I would be like, just simmer the fuck down. Like, this is not your war to fight. Basically, what I see it, I'm a white person. It's not my war to fight necessarily arm in arm with the oppressed minorities of the world. It's not my war. It's not my role. I can't do that. What I can do is do my part in dismantling step by step, stone by stone, the negative structures that are in place that imprison myself and that imprison the minds of white people and of Black people and of other colored people together. And I can do that
That's the
as a
same
white
war, brother.
father.
That's the same war.
Yeah, I can do that as a white father of a white child living in a white country. I can do a lot of good by doing that, even though it's a very small good, but it's at least one white person who doesn't think of skin color in moral terms. And that is the one thing I kind of distilled it down for me. My son is not colorblind. My son sees ethnicity because you would be stupid to pretend you don't see different phenotypes, because that's what makes humanity fascinating. And it was a kind of real breakthrough for me when I lived in Ottawa, and there are black people, of course, right? And I started realizing at one point, it's not just that they don't just all look the same, they look wildly different from each other. Crazy. Once I started, like, there was like this breakthrough. One day I was sitting on the bus and I looked like, what's with the eye shapes? Like, what the hell? They're all like weird and like all over the place. Eye shapes. They go up, they go down, they're straight, they're narrow, they're wide. Like, why have I never seen that before? This is so cool. You notice this, but the important thing is there's no moral judgment here. It's like, oh, people with African heritage have a really crazy phenotypical diversity. Nuts. And you compare this then to people who have the ancestry out of Africa, and then you look at the genetic history of the world. Yeah, of course, almost nobody left Africa. Leaving Africa was like this massive bottleneck where all the diversity was left in Africa, and like only a very small range of diversity ever trickled out. And that's just fascinating. And my son sees that, and I see that. I think everybody should see that, but simply as like, oh, cool. Humans are really different. Awesome. But
Yeah,
there's
but
no value attachment.
unfortunately, that's not the world we live in, right? Where what it's been
Exactly.
tainted, that vision.
Exactly. And we cannot notice these differences.
Maybe give you a little bit of insight into my perspective as a black person,
Mhm.
um, on some of the things that you said, because it kind of has drawn into focus for me some of the consequences of the implementation of a tyrannical racial hierarchy, which is the differentiation of our life experiences based on how we're racialized, right?
Mhm.
Because a lot of the things that you're talking about, right, they actually don't apply the same way to people who are racialized black. And so let me explain. So like you're talking about the upbringing and raising your son, and right, and coming to recognize these differences and how you're describing the differences. Well, if you think about a racialized black person growing up in a country with generations of white supremacy embedded into the national just zeitgeist,
Everything.
So ultimately, that's a history filled with violence. That's a history filled with um, aspersions of inferiority for black people from the time that you come out, basically. So, black people typically learn about the racial hierarchy through experiencing racism.
Mhm.
And then they come home and they're like, hey, this happened. I don't really get this. And their parents are like, okay.
Let's have
So,
the talk. Let's
yeah,
have the talk,
right.
right?
So here's the talk. But like the talk is different, right, than the one that you're having with your son, because our talk is about like our literal survival. We could literally die
Yes.
from
Yes.
not understanding. And like,
Absolutely.
and like, so for me, right, like, I guess for my own personal experience, the talk that I had was, it wasn't depressing. It wasn't like you should be fearful or anything like that. I didn't get that kind of talk. It was more just like educating me on the history. And so I learned about the history. But one thing that I learned was that that was all in the past. And that
Mm.
was something that I believed. And I believed it. And that message that I learned from the very beginning, I took that throughout all the way until probably I was still hanging on to it even in law school. And so I'm talking like, you know, 12 years ago, like 10 years ago. I was still holding on to it, that idea. Oh,
How though?
because
How were you capable of holding on to that idea that
even
it's
with
still
all the racism I experienced, like before that
yeah.
time, yeah, because it was the same thing that you experienced, brother, just in a different context.
Uh-huh.
Because it went to the core of my being, it would mean, right, something about the way that I live my life. If I were to accept the reality that people are going to look upon me that way no matter what I do. right? So like it's funny because black people on social media, if you look at Twitter, for example, you always see people being like, oh, you think you're a victim, you have a victim mentality, this and that. That's not something anyone wants. Nobody wants to be a victim. People want to feel
I say
empowered.
privileged people. Privileged people love playing the victim.
Well, they love playing the victim, but they don't want to like actually be the victim, right? Like they
No,
like playing
sucks.
the
Being a
victim as
victim
like,
sucks.
yeah,
It's like really.
right. As a
It's
power play,
actually
they
in
might.
German youth culture, it's a word imported from Turkish culture. We literally use the word victim as an insult.
And it's being used here that way, right? Like I mean that's when people are using it against me on social media and telling me that I have a victim mentality, they mean it as an insult, right? They mean that like I'm mentally weak, right? And that if I were mentally stronger somehow racism would disappear or something.
There's something else I kind of sometimes suspect. There's something extremely useful to the people who benefit the most from our system in having simultaneously allowed debate about racism and also not provide viable avenues for solving it. The racial conflict in America is extremely useful for the elites. That's my firm belief. I think identity, the original identity politics is white identity politics, right? We as the white people invented identity politics. That's not what colored people did. We invented that. By the way, in Spain, most people don't know that whiteness was, in my opinion, really invented in Spain during the Spanish Reformation, when they started going, what is a true-blooded Spaniard versus a converso or a former Arab? Well done,
Oh yeah,
reformers.
the
Well done,
racism in
Reformation.
Spain, it's thick out there, y'all.
And,
Yeah,
and
no, the racism in Spain,
Yeah, and it's like
and
it was
Portugal
literally
as well.
invented
Yeah.
in the Spanish Reformation in the consequence of the Reconquista. So there was already a hostile intent in the whole construction of racism. And then, of course, you have the colonization of America, etc. Anyway, I forgot where I kind of was going with this. But oh yeah, here's the thing. What would be more terrifying to the economic and political elites of North America than poor Appalachians and poor black ghetto people and all these poor people saying, you know what? We're fighting all the wrong enemy. Because what is it to a white person, the average white person, that, for example, let's put it this way. Let's take the Harvard College. What is it to me as the average white person, whether or not the president of Harvard was or was not an DEI pick, and that there was some better suited white person who wasn't picked? What's it to me? Why does it matter? Right?
Because they imagine themselves as the president of Harvard who didn't who didn't get that job. They literally think it's them.
And then there's another thing, okay? And this is where I find that there's a field of psychology called social psychology, and in particular, social identity theory. Here's something really interesting. So when the screen was black and white and mostly white in general, like it was mostly white people the main actors and black people were not represented. Black people felt excluded from that, but at the same time, because I think it was just a given. Films just didn't have black people in there. Now something interesting happened. Now people realize, well, maybe we should cast black people in not just the role of either criminal or slave or something equal, but just some normal person. And we should cast them, I don't know, in the role of a superhero. Now black people are happy because they are represented. White people, however, are unhappy. And here's the question, why they're unhappy. Thing is, it makes no difference to a black person whether or not the superhero person is a black actor. It makes zero difference. Like seriously, it makes no material difference whatsoever. I don't even think it solves racism, but it's just something nice to see. For the white person, it attacks the identity, because think about it, you're a poor white person in America. Throughout history, what did you have to console yourself with low economic status? Well, at the very least, you weren't black, right? The very
Exactly
least,
right.
you weren't black. Like, that's even why I don't like this insult white trash, because there's a racism built into that that I don't like.
100%. 100%.
Yeah. So then the thing is, I'm a poor white person, but all the people in all the top positions are all white. And I have been raised from the beginning, because let's remember, white identity politics is the original identity politics. White people are running the world. So however shit it is for me, at least I have that, right? Even if I don't consciously think about it. But now a black person is in a position of power and influence where there used to be a white person. Now I'm losing even that as a white person. Now these people I've been taught for centuries, at least I'm not them. Suddenly one of them goes in a position that used to be reserved for people like me. And so white people feel the same need for representation as black people, except we had the entire representation. So every time you take it away, we feel it as a loss, or white people feel that as a loss, and black people feel it as a gain, even though materially it makes no bloody difference whatsoever. And this is very convenient, because now people get upset about what color person was cast in what role of which Hollywood blockbuster that makes zero difference to their lives, and that's what they get upset about, right? This is what we spend our intellectual limited time and energy on, talk about representation, which matters. Yes, it matters. But instead of asking ourselves, what other things could we talk about? Why should I, as a white person, get upset about the black person being cast in the superhero role? That makes no difference to my life. I have a lot in common with poor black people because I'm poor. But as a poor white person, at the very least, I'm not a poor black person, right? I always have that. And this, for example, goes when, for example, poor white people hear about police brutality against black people. They also have negative experience with police, because you don't want to be a poor white person dealing with police. It sucks by white standards. It's just when you're a poor black person interacting with police, it sucks even more. So the white person, the poor white person who knows that police suck, now hears that the police shot a black person, everybody gets upset about it. And they say, why do you get upset about that? Like, what's so special about the black people getting shot, but white people also get shot by police, which they do. And now I get upset about this representation there. And now I get upset about black people getting upset about them being mistreated in a way that I cannot relate to, instead of realizing, hey, they have bad problems with police. I have bad problems with police. Police suck. But police is white, and here's something else. Black people didn't grow up dreaming of becoming cops.
Well, some of them did.
Sure. But generally speaking, cops are coded white. So as a white person, cops are white. Therefore, if black people protest against cops, they also protest against whiteness, which is me as a white person. If a cop shoots a black person, it's probably a white cop shooting a black person by definition. So this becomes a racial issue. It becomes not a police issue. Sorry, I'm a little confused. It's a somewhat intricate argument I'm trying to flesh here. The issue is police brutality, right? But for a black person, racism comes on top of that. It makes the police brutality that much worse. And here's the other thing. Identity politics is a common language in North America we understand. If there was a protest about police brutality when a black person gets shot, it wouldn't have the same power. It wouldn't have the same resonance, because police brutality is not something we talk about outside the context of race. So what I mean is, the race discussion is very convenient because you can turn everything into a race discussion, and therefore make it about race, and therefore lose all the white people who know that every race discussion is fundamentally an attack on white people, which it isn't. And therefore they can dismiss it as a concern, which also means there's no solidarity among black people with white people who get also screwed over by the system, because these white people are trained not to be solidar with the black people when it comes to that.
But bro, I'm gonna throw a wrinkle in here. All right,
Please do.
The reality here, okay, which is that it reminds me of the Tony Timpa story. I don't know if you're familiar with Tony Timpa. He was executed, by a police officer, a racialized white man. He was just, mowed down, and it was all on video. The video was released, and people would always use him on social media as an example of how Black Lives Matter claims to be about police brutality, but I don't hear them talking about Tony Timpa. Black Lives Matter actually did support Tony Timpa's case and talk about it, and many other racialized white people. It's not it's actually the case
But
that
it's not
black people
told.
who are
That
fighting against
story
police
is not
brutality.
told.
I'm sorry?
And that is where the media comes in, right?
Right.
We tell the stories we are used to. Black people being upset about a white person being killed is not a story that is easily told.
It's not a story that is told. Like, you would have to actually, I only found out because I researched. I
Yeah,
went
I've
and
never heard
tried
of
to
it.
find
I've never
out,
heard of it.
you know?
But I think there is an implicit, it's not, I'm not saying it's a conspiracy, okay?
Me
It's
either.
a social conspiracy. Let me put this way. There's some things, let's step back. Sometimes the metaphor of conspiracy makes sense because it simplifies what you're analyzing, okay? As long as you don't reify the conspiracy, as long as you don't believe there is an actual conspiracy going on where people sit together in the bar and bulldoze this out. But the conspiracy is in the expectations of how a story should be told and what kind of stories should be told. And therefore, we are used to telling the police brutality story in racialized terms, as in it's about black people being mistreated by the police. And therefore, it's a race story. It's not even a story about the police. And therefore, white people are kind of excluded from this problem, even though white people, poor white people, also have a problem with police. It just doesn't have the added baggage of the racism on top of that, right? Therefore, there's very limited psychological drive among white people to be show solidarity with black people here, not because a black person got killed, but because somebody got killed by the police who is also black, therefore it makes it worse. But there's no challenge against the entire institution as such. It's always limited to the identity politics. And the identity politics are important. They are relevant. They matter. They shape the special experience of black people in America that is different from white people. But there is a level there that is separate, and that is the brutalization of the poor and the economic lumpenproletariat, so to say, by the forces of the state, and by keeping the poor people at each other's throat over racial issues, you definitely prevent solidarity among black and white people. The answer to that is not to pretend there is no racial issue. I think the answer here is to understand as a white person, the racism against black people is, in a twisted, indirect way, targeted against me as a white person as well.
But see, this is
Because
the
it
issue. This is the
diminishes.
issue, Dietwald, is that racialized white people accept that. That's what you end up finding. That's what you end up realizing when you go down that path, is that like there is an acceptance of that level of dehumanization and death that the white community experiences. They're willing to accept it if they get the benefits of whiteness. And that's the problem.
Yes.
That's
And
the
that
issue.
is, but to me, as I said, because I'm an anarchist, right? I'm a radical anarchist, even though I don't run around with a black bandana and stuff. I occasionally even wear a suit. I have been seen to wear a tie too. It's been a while. I know, shocking. But the point is, to me, there's no benefit in this, right? As a white person, this is a weird thing. White people kind of seem to think that removing racism is kind of disadvantageous to white people, when it absolutely isn't, because removing racism, like reducing racism, also reduces animosity and hostility in society as such. Because what is it a benefit to me as a white person that when I meet a black person, my main attention is on their racial identity rather than on anything else? I'm missing out on so much more in my fellow human beings. And that's why I'm against nationalism. When I meet a person from another country, if I identify them as simply a foreigner, I'm missing out on so much more. So it's improvisation. While black people suffer from it materially in a maximal way, doesn't mean that it's a benefit to white people who are defined as white as such. It's a benefit to a tiny elite in the world that includes black people as well. Because a rich black person has nothing relevant in common with a poor black person. They are rich, and their main interest in keeping the peasants away from the castle gates, and they will work together just nicely with the white oligarchs, and the black oligarchs will work together just nicely, because they face a bigger enemy, and that is the broad population. They're keeping very well controlled with media and bullshit, And racism, while it's not designed, actually, racism was designed for that purpose. If you think about the original invention of white identity, it was literally designed to separate white people from the Native Americans first, because lots of white people, when they came to America, they didn't stay in the white settlements. They had two looks at how the Native Americans lived, like, get me out of here, I want that. Whatever they have, I want that. And so we had to portray the Native Americans as these wild savages, which they were not perceived as in the beginning. And then we transferred this to the black people, because somehow you have to justify hurting a person for slavery, because as much as everybody recognizes physiological difference in people, convincing us that this has moral significance takes effort.
And that's why they needed to push that idea in so many different contexts. That's why you had to get the church involved, get them to preach white supremacy, get them to preach racial hierarchy. That's why you had to get academics involved, teaching
and science,
skull size, right? And like all this stuff. Oh, look, we're proving that black people are inferior. Look,